Welcome to the fourth and the last substantive episode of our podcast on the philosophy of language. Today, we have the very marvelous, very enlightening, and very mystical, so to speak, personality that we're going to discuss today. Of course, Jacques Derrida, philosopher extraordinaire, a pioneer of the field of post-structuralism and the post-structural movement, which sort of kicked off to entire movement within philosophy that constitutes the post-structural and postmodern philosophy. The influence of Derrida, cannot be understated, in any manner. And yes, of course, Jacques Derrida was part of my research report, so I'll introduce him this time. So Jacques Derrida was born in 1930 in French Algeria, and later, when he reached the age of 14, he took admission he came to France, came to Paris, and took admission in the prestigious École de Normal, which was basically one of the most prestigious schools of philosophy in France at that time. Many philosophers of that time, including people like Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, had graduated from him, studied there, taught there. Wonderful institution, and of course, Jacques Derrida gave the entrance to that place twice, and it was only the second time he got selected there, which is something that I relate to on a very personal level. Coming to NLU Delhi, it's very wonderful, talking about his life, of course, as a Jewish Algerian person living in France, and the way, the lens through which he looked at philosophy, though, yeah, and with the lens especially he looked at Western philosophy, it's very interesting to look at. But at the same time, we need to, of course, respect the sentiment that Derrida himself expressed, that he does not want a reductionist view of his world taken in light of the origins, and the fact that he was a Jew from Algeria, and all the anti-Semitism he faced during his life. Of course, it's very interesting, but that is not something that he wishes to let us sort of get in the way of interpreting his philosophy in a broader manner, and we are going to respect that through the course of our discussion on Jacques Derrida. So Jacques Derrida, of course, borrows from and goes beyond the ideas that are espoused by the structuralist thinkers like Ferdinand de Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and all these very heavy thinkers. Hence, because he borrows from structuralism but also goes beyond it, the movement that he starts is called post-structuralist movement. As in coming after structuralism. Derrida's intervention to our understanding of language has a consequence on this presumably every discipline that has anything to do with language, or anything that has to do with philosophy. That includes philosophy, sociology, literature, anthropology, historiography, social linguistics, psychoanalysis, political theory, and of course, the subject that is of special interest to us, that is law. So I'll just introduce a bit about his philosophy, and the critique wherein from here, which he was proceeding, right? So Derrida talked about a bias that has existed in philosophy, even since before preceding, Socrates, even from pre-Socratics to the present, right? Which he calls the problem of logocentrism within philosophy, which is often referred to by an alternate but like closely related term, that is the metaphysics of presence. I'll talk about, and Derrida introduces the concept of logocentrism in one of his most seminal texts, that is Of Grammatology, that came about in 1967. And where the Derrida holds that the history of metaphysics from pre-Socratics to Heidegger has always assigned the origin of truth to the general logos, or general method of reason, which sort of refers to something out there in the world. So broadly speaking, logocentrism in Western philosophy is the general assumption that there is a realm of truth that exists prior to and independent of its representation in linguistic science. We talked about in last episode about how Saussure talks about that the relationship between the signifier and signifier is arbitrary, and there is no inherent reason why the process of signification sort of refers to something out there in the world. So Derrida sort of brings on that, talks about logocentrism in philosophy, which frequently assumes that there is a reality out there, which is independent of our of linguistic science and the way we construct language. Right, and this is a prejudice that is inherently linked where we treat the sign as something distinct, and that is we treat signs as something distinct and that are distinct from and inessential to the phenomena that they represent. And of course, this is where he talks about his critique of logocentrism. As you know, a very good example, of course, would be Plato's conceptions of forms, as in something that exists out there in the world as a certain idea, as a certain universal, where from every property derives its essence from. That is, and every object that exists in the world derives its essence from form. And it is a logocentric, of course, Derrida would say that it is a logocentric interpretation of the world, because it assumes that there is a world out there that can be interpreted, which is not sort of constructed by language itself. This is where Derrida is coming from when he talks about uh, that there is that the prejudice in philosophy, that there is out there something in the world for us to interpret, for a rational minds to interpret, is a prejudice that is deeply seated in philosophy, right? So I'll come to metaphysics of presence. Of course, the reality, as in when we talk about logocentric reality, what we are basically looking at is a reality that becomes an object of discovery, right? As something that is present in the world instead of being construction through language, right? This is what he calls the metaphysics of presence, right? And from here, of course, it is easy to understand Derrida's conception of philosophy as the metaphysics of presence. Everyone is trying to prove that there is something that exists out there in the world, and what the previous philosophers are doing is actually getting wrong what is actually present there. Instead of just trying to construct their own concepts through language, which is, of course, an idea that that of course comes after Derrida's critique of logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence. Right, the object of philosophy, of course, has been to make present the truth that has always been assumed to be made obscured by error, ignorance, or by the unclarity of language, so to speak. And language has therefore been regarded as an imperfect medium. Right, the object is to get behind the language to the real thing. As to the imperfections of language have been realized by philosophers, but the goal, as in we discussed with Wittgenstein, right? What he's trying to do is that he's trying to point out towards the miscommunication that happened to the language, and it is the real reality. The reality in a sense is in showing rather than telling, right? Because language is an imperfect medium, so we should always refer to things that exist out there in the world. So Derrida would of course say that what Wittgenstein is doing here is the metaphysics of presence, right? What he's trying to say that there's a world that exists out there which language cannot represent. That is why language is is an inferior tool. But Derrida argues that our reality itself is in many ways constructed by language itself. It's very, very interesting, and of course I'd like to call Ananya to sort of talk about and expand on Derrida's ideas, and talk about, of course, Derrida's idea of difference, which is a fundamental aspect which he sort of picks from, where he picks from Saussure but also goes beyond him. Ananya, please.
Yeah, thanks, Abhineet. So, with Derrida, it's difficult to expound any idea associated with him as something that is the case, because when we do that, it might actually be repugnant to his entire philosophy and to the project on which he had embarked. So, what Derrida had insisted upon is that difference is neither a word nor a concept. So, all that it was is a play on the French word différer, which means at the same time to differ from something, and also to defer, as in DEFER, in time, such as in postponing. So Derrida humors himself in the fact that the A in difference is only read but cannot be heard, and therefore the French word difference, the English word of difference, and difference spelled with an A are pronounced the same. So what Derrida wants to denote through all this is that difference in meaning, as in the case of Saussurian linguistics, differs from one another, like in a given point of time, by meaning, but also differs in time, as in is a, like, the time factor is also involved. So for instance, a cat is a cat because it differs from a dog, a cow, a horse, a lion, or any other such animal. But what a cat is also differed. A black cat may be a qualifier attached to a cat, which gives further meaning to a cat alone. And a black cat which is sitting in my lap also adds meaning to the cat. Therefore, the process of signification never ends, and we can add an infinite number of qualifiers. So as we go on, and so this is a process which has a time element to it, right? Because as you go on and go on explaining further with more number of words. It's a time bound process, and therefore it's related to time, and the process never ends. So what this means is that as we can go on talking more and more about what sets the particular cat in question different from any other animal or any other cat or any other black cat or any other black cat sitting on one's lap. So what that means is that the meaning can never be certain. So this challenges the idea of Saussurean idea of synchronic linguistics, the idea that there is something called a static language which can be studied as a stock concept and not a flow concept. So Derrida holds that meaning always has a spatial as well as a temporal dimension to it. And now if Pranay could talk a bit more about deconstruction.
All right. So, deconstruction is a term that has been used a bit too broadly in the academic language. However, Derrida's usage of the term referred to a particular type of theoretical intervention. It wasn't a theory per se, that the way the Western tradition has understood theory. Uh, Derrida's focus is on the many binaries that are inherent within the Western tradition. These include binaries like presence and absence, speech and writing, nature and culture, inside, outside, mind and body, etc. These opposition pose a peaceful coexistence of vis-a-vis, but in actuality contain within them a violent hierarchy. Uh, Derrida points out these hierarchies. Uh, he says that we should dismantle our excessive loyalty to any idea and learning to see the aspect of the truth that might lie buried in its opposite. So this is what basically deconstruction is. It describes how we think. Uh, and Western philosophers since Socrates has privileged speech, which was seen as authentic communication, over writing, which was regarded as a mere transcript of what people might say. Uh, like a second-hand report, uh, lacking the interaction and truthfulness that comes with conversations. It might not seem like a very important issue, but the work of Derrida comes from the bigger idea he developed from this claim, which was that uh, we think that we engage in privileging of one over the other. Like we privilege speech over writing, we privilege words over pictures, men over women, reason over passion, sight over touch. So this privilege binds us to see the merits and values of the supposedly inferior part. So we can't see their merits, and but even so, they are worthy of like our attention, and we can like learn many things from them. If we live intelligently, we can see both sides of them. Like both needs to be seen uh, to understand a better, to like further our knowledge. Like for example, we always perceive that equality is better than inequality, but like many things are not equal, right? Because teachers are put on higher pedestals than students. So to deconstruct an idea is to show that it is confused and riddled with logical defects. So we must keep its messiness constantly in mind. And so Derrida basically says that uh, these hierarchy in themselves would demonstrate an artificially constructed and so far a position to inscribe all phenomena inside it. So Derrida takes the example of opposition that the famous philosopher Claude Lévi-Strauss makes between nature and culture in his research. He points out how incest prohibition is universal, so it may be implied that it is natural, but it is also a prohibition, a system of norms, interdicts. And that sense, it is cultural. This exposes the binary as something that has been constructed in language, rather than being an immutable property of reality itself. A process of any such construction marginalizes categories that do not fit into its folds and leads to the domination of a particular perspective of things that masquerades itself as a truth, despite being a clearly logocentric perspective of reality. So that was his Derrida's concept of logocentrism. Now, if Abhineet would like to talk more about the trace of Derrida.
Thank you, Pranay. That was a very wonderful explanation of what deconstruction is, and of course, he tries to take these the idea of deconstruction a bit forward through his idea of trace, right? So, whenever we sort of deconstruct a binary or deconstruct a binary opposition, deconstruct a concept, what it necessarily creates, like a metaphysical rupture in that concept, as in when we talk about the idea of we deconstruct the idea of nature and culture, as he did in his essay, The Structure, Sign and Pain, in the discourse of human languages, where from Pranay gave a beautiful example of how the incest prohibition is somewhat lies in the boundary of this hierarchy between nature and culture, and so this hierarchy breaks when we talk about things like incest prohibition, right? So it is of course creating a rupture in this metaphysical structure, and what happens after that, that is where the trace comes in. The process of signification, we can say, is very much obsessed with making concept present and apparent to us, right? But Derrida would also like us to focus on its absence, right? So this privileging of absence and presence of course comes into picture again. So what the trace exactly is, the trace is the absent sign of a sign's presence, right? And we see how in Derrida's explanation of difference, meaning is always deferred and deferred infinitely in an endless chain of signification, right? So that means that meaning can never be fully present to us. Therefore, there's always a part of meaning which is absent in the process of signification, and only trace it's left behind, right? I'll give an example to illustrate that. We took an example of a cat, right? Ananya gave the example of a cat, where we can say that the meaning of the cat is deferred, right? A cat can also be a black cat. A cat can also be a cat that is sitting on my lap, and there can be, and further we can say a cat that is sitting on my lap which is in the room, right? So there is like another chain of qualifier attached to it which can go on endlessly, right? But can we say that the meaning, or the meaning of the black cat in itself is incomplete? That does not make sense. We cannot say that, right? There is of course a part of signification that is absent in that case, right? So the black cat sort of has a trace of sitting on my lap, but it sort of, it is the absent part of the science presence, so to speak, that is always stuck in some at some point in the process of signification, right? That is what basically he calls the trace, right? So this is, in this way, nothing can be made certain, right? There can be no final reading of a text, so to speak, because there cannot be any correct interpretation of a phenomena, because it is always endlessly deferred in a chain of signification, right? So no matter how much reason we use, we cannot arrive, this is the correct interpretation of reality. It will always be a logocentric interpretation of reality if we do not sort of just take into account the fact that the process of signification is endless, right? So, however, the mere reversal of a metaphysical opposition, might not challenge the governing, sort of the governing framework, or the presuppositions that are attempting to be reversed, right? So, what do you exactly mean by that? It would not do justice for deconstruction if we merely place, for, as we said, speech has been privileged over writing. So, the way we fix it is not by, privileging writing in place of speech, right? That is not what, Derrida is trying to, arrive at. Or, if there's a division between nature and culture, Derrida is not asking that, we have been privileging nature, now let's privilege culture or something, right? So what he's trying to get at is that Derrida would ask us to examine, these metaphysical binaries to expose such traces, right? The object is not the reversal of binary and not even its destruction, but a careful deconstruction of it, right? So destruction, as in, we can refer to Heidegger's, idea of deconstruction of metaphysics and whatnot. That is not, the subject of our discussion, and then it is, of course, speculated that Derrida got his idea of deconstruction, as a play on, Heidegger's idea of destruction. What he's trying to do is not to destroy something; he's trying to deconstruct something. And to highlight that such oppositions are always constructed and made present. The reality is in the fact, is the one idea is always dependent on other, right? So without the existence of culture, there is no nature to speak of, right? And without, the existence of good, there's no bad, and all these hierarchies that sort of exist are very much dependent on each other. And after the exposition of the prejudices that exist in language and philosophy, and bringing into light that what has been left on its margins, we engage in sort of a reconstruction of that ensemble, right? And as Derrida writes in a letter to a Japanese friend in 1983, the undoing or the decomposing or desegmenting of the structures was not a negative operation, and rather than destroying, it was always necessary to understand how an ensemble was constituted and how to reconstruct it to the end quote, right? So what Derrida is like getting at here is that when we expose these metaphysical ruptures, we should always recognize their trace. We should always recognize that these binaries are always constructed artificially. We should always recognize that there are points where these binaries break, and it is from that we reconstruct. We keep in mind that there's nothing like natural or logocentric truth about all these, and all of these things are constructed, and any sort of oppression or any sort of problematic sort of political or social claims that we make out of these ideas is always contingent upon, and is always constructed. So it can very easily be deconstructed, and these ideas can be liberated. So it's always necessary to keep that in mind. That is what Derrida is coming at here. And now I'd like to call upon Nitai to sort of reflect on the legal implications of Derrida's work and the impact that it has on law. Nitai, please.
Right. So speaking of the mystical foundations of law and the legal implication of Derrida's works, so what we may reasonably assume is that with an interpretation as volatile as deconstruction, there are many consequences that we can imagine with respect to the very idea of law itself, right? So what we know is that the entire exercise of law as manifested by legal institutions is to separate law from that which is not law, or as in the case of legal positivists, to separate law from morality. But we do not need deconstruction to experience the kind of problems such an exercise runs into, right? So our legal theory and practice is replete with them. Deconstruction, however, offers us good insight as to why this problem occurs in the first place. So one of the classic examples that we may take up from jurisprudence is the problem that the dichotomy of law and non-law runs into, and that is that which is highlighted by Hans Kelsen, a theorist who famously wished to free, quote-unquote, free law from the metaphysical mist with which it has been covered at all times, right? So Kelsen basically conceived of law as a set of principles emanating from the principle or the Grundnorm, for example, a constitution. So all that delineates from the Grundnorm is law and therefore legal. However, what we must recognize is that the Grundnorm itself is in a dubious position from the perspective of such an interpretation of law. This is a fact that Kelsen himself has recognized, that the Grundnorm is not something that can be explained by jurisprudence. It can just accept it as a sociological or historical fact. So therefore, on the one hand, Grundnorm is in a sense the most fundamental aspect of law. It is the most basic and important law of a jurisdiction. It is at the same time not law at all, going by Kelsen's exposition of law. It is the self-contradictory nature of the Grundnorm that makes the binary of law and non-law dubious. It is what we may say in a sense of finality, which is always requiring more questions to be asked. So similar objections can be drawn on other logocentric approaches of the identification of law, like the Austrian sovereign, which subjectifies the sovereign authority as a sole arbiter of law. Fuller's idea of natural law, based on assumptions that have made themselves present in the very notion of law, and Hart's rule of recognition, which lends space to the dominant convention to determine the criteria for the acceptance of the law. Right, so any attempt to create an inside-outside binary within the law is only prone to run into difficulties.
Thank you very much, Nitai, for those observations. Pranay, if you could take forward the discussion of implications of Derrida's philosophy and law.
So continuing from where Nitai left about the mystical foundations of law, we must understand that law is necessarily like this. It cannot recognize all differences, but simply provide a way of proceeding without which it could go nowhere. Derrida, however, does not leave us in complete darkness on the question of law and justice. In the 1989 symposium held at New York, titled Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice, Derrida gives a very important that keynote address explaining what he called the force of law. This he called this force as not always violent, but in some cases it might be violent, but rather refers to something more discursive. For instance, there is a force involving in putting the will of the legislature in the form of act, the opinion of a judge in a form of a judgment, and the grievance of a person in a petition, all of which cast in legal terms something that is phenomenal. That is, it is an act of interpretation. Derrida points out to the expression enforce the law while discussing a force. That is not to say that all law are enforced, but there can be no law without such hermeneutic forces being at work, whether it is a direct or indirect, physical or symbolic, interior or external. How do we make a distinction between unjust and violence? How do we determine what is just and what is unjust? As such, everything related to Derrida, there is no clear answer to this. The line delimiting the degree of force required to maintain law and order and that which exceed it is hazy and not at all that clear. So it cannot be made present. The originary violence that gives rise to the law in the first place, for example, a revolution that overthrows one regime and replaces it with another, replaces one legality with another. Thus, there is a point where the new legality is illegal as per the old legality. It is neither legal or illegal, and at the same time, it is it doesn't fall into either of those categories. Hence, through questioning the foundation of law, as Derrida says, we realize it is neither foundationalist nor anti-foundationalist. These contradictions are therefore sometimes inherent in the law. So, in a way, its origins are always mystical. However, deconstruction is not without its imperatives to the judges who must construct the law. We must remember that the law, by its very nature, reduces, simplifies, and excludes that which is deemed to be the other. Judges must not forget that law presents us with an inability to distribute justice in a case by case manner. That job is left to adjudication. Judges must adopt a reflective approach. So the force of law which makes it present to us in an instant for justice may not found in law itself, it is always deferred. What we can find in law is the trace of justice. So modern liberal democracies often incorporate in the framework the doctrine of separation of power, which denotes the separation between the creation of law and the application of law. However, it misses the fact that one can easily point out how all application is always creation, not only because of the fact that it must be interpreted in an act which is always involves original input, but also because the facts of the case are always different. The possibility of justice, therefore, is opened by the admission of judicial responsibility above other things. So this was the mystical nature of law, according to mystical foundation of law, according to Derrida. Now, if Abhineet would like to give the conclusion.
Thank you very much, Pranay. That was indeed very, very enlightening. Of course, the way that we look at deconstruction and the world post deconstruction, and and its implications of law, we are presented with a very different reality that we will have if we take, for example, the very logocentric approaches to law, whether it be the Hart's rule of recognition, Kelson's Grundnorm, or nature and Fuller's inherent morality of law, right? So there are, of course, the very different picture that Derrida paints for us, and it's a very, very it's a very interesting insight into what law is and how it works, right? And of course, there are many ways to look at the world in which Derrida leaves us. There are many critics of Derrida who sort of portray him as a type of a hermeneutic mafia, who's always out there to destroy the concept of meaning or the foundations that are much beloved in Western traditions, right? So it is, in a way, he's anti-foundationalist. He's treated as a dystopian figure within philosophy, especially within the field of analytic philosophy more than anyone else, right? However, it is important to remember the questioning of the dominant structures may present itself as an act of questioning dominance itself, right? Dominance of predominant modes of thinking, dominance of predominant way that we do philosophy, and it is of course unsettling for people who are in dominant positions of society. This, which is a sort of a tool that Derrida presents us for their critique, and it's very important the way that Derrida looks at these questions, and the way that we interact with these questions, and but for people who value his work and value Derrida's tools of deconstruction, difference, trace, it presents with us a ready toolbox of interventions through which we can explore and expose many of our deep-seated prejudices and assumptions, and present to us a world which is always cast afresh, sans the maladies that has always plagued it. The life and the work of Derrida present to us to us possibilities of a new way to look at world, where the finality of meaning and ideas is no longer a thing. Which is what our teachers tell us in the first semester of legal methods, that there are certain wrong answers to things, but there is no one correct answer to anything. There is no final reading of the text. The meaning of the meaning is always endlessly deferred in a infinite chain of signification, and there is nothing in the world that you can say is the objective truth that exists out there independent of the way that we have constructed it, which is something that is the most beautiful which is the most beautiful contribution of Derrida, saying that everything is contingent, and you can sort of look at anything and deconstruct it and reconstruct it to make the world a more fair, and make the world a more just, and make a world more sensible place to live in, which is I think one of the most beautiful parts of Derrida's philosophy, and all of the philosophy of language, sort of the way that it has shifted our perception about the finality of things, about the presence of things, about the certainty of things, to this world where we can design it to be more kind to people whom it has been historically unkind to, just to people who it has historically been unjust to, and fair to people whom it has historically been unfair to. And that, I think, is the essence of the entirety of our exercise of studying language, and the essence of studying law as a discipline, right? And it's very beautiful the way that we look at it, and it's very wonderful, it's very enlightening. With this, we come to the end of this episode, and also end of the substantive part of our discussion on the philosophy of language. I thank everyone who stayed with us throughout this journey, and shared these very beautiful experiences with us. With this, we bid everyone a very warm adieu, and see you all together next time that we assemble. A very good evening. Thank you very much.